Perfect. Okay, about the lab and about us, I am Fabio Cabra Ribeiro, an assistant professor in the architecture school at LSU. It is my pleasure to welcome you today. I invite you to introduce yourself and where you are situated in the chat. I have the privilege of doing this out loud. I grew up in Venezuela. I started to work there as a professor, became the director of the biggest school of architecture in the country, and it was then in 2015 when I moved to Venice to do my PhD in urbanism. And after working in Spain for a year or so, I moved to Baton Rouge to start this adventure in LSU. I co-direct the Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab with my colleagues from the School of Architecture, Irene Brison and Anicia Street. We are joined in this initiative by the interdisciplinary group of LSU faculty, as Helen, who is with us today as one of the panelists, and we invite anyone from LSU or other institutions interested in joining to reach out. You can learn more about us in our website that I'm going to leave here on the chat for you. We understand the Caribbean as a broad region that coincides with other frames like Black Atlantic or Plantation America, including Louisiana and the Gulf Coast, and the coastal regions of Central and South America. The Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab was founded this year as a transdisciplinary collaborative center for research and design concerning the constructed environment of the Caribbean. We are supported by an LSU Provost Big Ideas seed grant, and we think that this is truly a big idea. The School of Architecture and of course our broad network of friends, family, and colleagues. We hope to create a transdisciplinary network of scholars, professionals, and organizations focused on environments and communities on the Greater Caribbean region. We launched the lab with the Caribbean Futures Workshop in February 2023, gathering scholars and practitioners from Haiti, Venezuela, Puerto Rico, Brazil, Uruguay, and the United States here at LSU to work with students and learn and envision potential futures in the context of accelerating climate change in sites across the Caribbean. You can see the outcomes of this workshop in our website on that link I sent you. About this colloquium series, we are hosting this colloquium series online because we wish to encourage an interdisciplinary and international and also multilingual conversation about spatial justice in the region. Above all, this is intended to be a series of introductions, and let me write them, change all of this here. Okay. A series of introductions, also resisting a legacy of isolation reinforced by imperial languages and political barriers to free movement in the Caribbean. We think it is critical that we cross boundaries to speak to each other and understand the challenges and strengths of the Caribbean from our many perspectives. Only then can we begin to generate innovative ideas and practical solutions for just future in the Caribbean and globally. We can debate the implication of this focus on orality, but this should not be a quiet event. If we were in person, I would expect laughter, sights, and sounds of agreement. Unfortunately, we need you to stay muted so we can hear the people that's going to be discussing at the beginning. But we invite you to continue using the chat, call out key phrases, pose questions or thoughts, respond to each other, share references and citations as the spirits move you. And prepare also by the end to share your questions and observations. So about today specifically, we will begin with the core presentation by Mark Raymond, Director of Graduate School of Architecture in the University of Johannesburg in South Africa, followed by Helen Regis' response, Associate Professor here at LSU in Geography and Anthropology. We will have time for maybe 10 to 15 or even more minutes for discussion at the end. When we come to this point, please raise your hand to speak or put your questions in the chat to be read out. With that, I invite Irene to proceed with the formal introduction. You are muted, Irene.
Thank you. We have to have that awkward moment. Sorry, I'm just trying to find my place. Thank you, Fabio, for welcoming everybody. So yes, I'm Irene Brisson. I'm also an assistant professor of architecture at LSU and a co-director of the Caribbean Spatial Justice Lab. And it's really my pleasure today to introduce our colloquium, which I think is going to open up some important questions and dialogue about cartographies of safety, of security, and of joy. Our main presenter is Mark Raymond, whose own trajectories really exemplify the movement that's characteristic of the Caribbean. So movement on a spectrum from forced to voluntary has been foundational to the formation and life of the Caribbean and all of those who live or have lived within its porous borders. And I think this paradoxical relationship between security and risk in the architecture and urbanism of the Caribbean and the African diaspora is one that really resonates with my research experiences in post-quake Haiti, where ideas of solidity, safety, and beauty came up often as people talked about ordinary architecture. The multiple scales and experiences of urban geography, movement, or transportation in Caribbean cities, like many global metropolitans, is a profound theme that I look forward to discussing after Mark and Helen's presentations. So formally, Mark Raymond is an architect and educator. He's currently director of the Graduate School of Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. After graduating from the Architectural Association in London, Mark worked on projects in Europe with Norman Foster, Conrad and Ulrich Brandy before returning to Port of Spain, Trinidad, and establishing his own practice. He's practiced individually and in collaboration with others on architectural and planning and urban planning and design projects in Trinidad and Tobago and throughout the Caribbean. Mark has been invited to speak, as we gladly have today, and been involved with architectural education in a great variety of roles at global institutions, including the University of the West Indies at St. Augustine, where he developed a comprehensive proposal for the establishment of a Center for Caribbean Architecture and Urbanism, the Caribbean School of Architecture in Kingston, Jamaica, the Universidad Nacional Pedro Enrique Ureña in the Dominican Republic, the University of Johannesburg and Virginia Tech, Yale, this is a long list, Harvard, Cornell, and Columbia universities in the United States. In 2021, he was the Plim Distinguished Professor at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. Mark obtained a PhD in Architecture and Design through RMIT's invitational practice-based PhD program, and he continues to combine his teaching and research role with practice internationally. So I am really delighted to hear from an architect and an educator with such a wide set of experiences in the Caribbean and in the United States, North America, and Africa. Okay, Mark, it's yours.
Okay, thank you so much, Irene, and good evening to everybody. Bonsoir, buenas tardes. Thank you very much for joining us this evening. Irene had actually invited me earlier this year to come to Louisiana to take part in a symposium, but unfortunately I wasn't able to. So I was really happy to get this invitation and the opportunity to participate in some of the conversations that you're having there. I'm going to give a presentation today that covers kind of a lot of things really, and I think, you know, whenever I'm asked to make a presentation, it can be a little bit confounding sometimes because so many things I feel like I'm constantly thinking about, as I'm sure it's the same for everybody, that endeavoring to kind of wrap them around a particular or specific idea is sometimes challenging, but the more I think through it, it's to try and find a kind of intersection between things that preoccupy me and the things that preoccupy the colloquium or the event. So I've endeavored to try to align some of the thoughts that I have had and I'm having with your theme. And I think they really revolve around, for me at the moment, I would say, two places. I'm in Johannesburg after having been practicing working in Trinidad for a very long time, since I studied in London, then been back to Trinidad. And I've been practicing there since 1992, before I came here 3 years ago. So my practice embraces the teaching I do here at the Graduate School of Architecture, and also embraces the practice that I have or had in Trinidad. And I think one of the things that engages me in the work that I do at the school here is how through practice, sometimes complex ideas or thoughts or desires, such as social engagement, the will to want to engage socially with architecture, and in a sense the sort of daily the daily rigor of sort of making buildings, and sometimes the interests I think that we have or that we develop when we're making buildings can be quite remote from ideas such as spatial justice, such as equality, diversity, inclusion. A lot of these ideas that I think we're kind of realizing more and more, it's essential to integrate into the work we do. And a lot of my research really revolves around practice. So whilst I think a lot of these ideas around social practice, social justice and spatial justice often move into other spaces, often move into spaces of political science, places of anthropology, ethnography, politics, sociology, many disciplines. But how we land them in our practice, I think, is the kind of the challenge that fascinates me. How we translate, in a sense, our desire for creative production, for creative practice, how we translate that practice. And it's something that we've been working very much with at the Graduate School of Architecture. And I just wanted to give you a little brief introduction to that, which is that it's a relatively new school. It's an independent school within the Faculty of Art, Design and Architecture at the University of Johannesburg. It's, I think, possibly one of the newest schools, if not the newest school in the African continent. It's the largest postgraduate school, and it's built around what Leslie Locker, who founded the school in its current iteration, what she termed transformative pedagogy. Transformation has a very significant meaning in South Africa. It doesn't have the generic meaning, I think, that it does in many places. Transformation really refers to the political, social, economic, and cultural transformation of post-apartheid South Africa. And it's a term that is used to engage with and address issues, primarily, I would say, issues around race, gender, and class, and how those ideas are implemented and incorporated in a progressive understanding of what contemporary society is. And it's an ethos and a set of ideas that drive the work of the school in really quite fundamental ways. I'm just going to begin by sharing some of the work of some students, and it's a fairly random selection of the types of work that the students engage with, and through a variety of projects that are located in familiar territories or personal territories or locales. The work tries to kind of, and the thematics of the units try to unpack or deviate from the trap or the tropes of conventionalized sort of Western canonical knowledge and bodies of knowledges, in the hope of trying to formulate new trajectories and new formulations of knowledge and practice. The work's experimental. Sometimes we get it wrong, but very often we get it right in terms of the direction that the work is moving in. And students, I think, in most cases, by the time they have left the school are in a way kind of liberated from some of the constraints of the conventions that normally dominate or preoccupy architectural educational models. So it's a very exciting space to be in and to be involved in. But we're talking a lot now about how we can translate this transformative thinking that exists through the project, the speculative and imaginative project work. How do we translate that work? How do we translate those ideas into practice or into practices? And I think it's a really critical question. And it speaks to this imperative, I think, that seems to be more and more prevalent of how we do translate our thinking about architecture and our idealization of what architecture might be or how it might perform or how it might operate. How does the thinking and speculation of that around that manifest itself in practice? How can the transformative pedagogy become a transformative practice? So I think implicit in that, in a way, is how I think what I'm going to share today intersects with this idea of spatial justice. And I'm going to kind of move between, I think, my own experiences in this space, where in South Africa and in Johannesburg, it's a place that still confronts in a very blatant, very tangible, very visceral way the idea of injustice. That whilst apartheid has ended, theoretically, technically, manifestly, in many ways, the practices that were perpetuated under that still persist in many, many forms, and particularly spatially. And I think through the work we do at the school, we try and unwrap that and decipher that and understand how that framework of knowledge can be translated into practices or effective methodologies or operations that challenge preconceptions and that allow a shift, allow a movement towards a more liberated practice. And I'm constantly in this space, in a way, comparing my experience to my experience in Trinidad, which is also a post-colonial society, which is also a place that has had a highly contested political and racialized history, and many more similarities than one might readily perceive. And so for me, being in this sort of two spaces, occupying one in my memory and one in the present moment through my teaching practice, I think is what I'm going to try and kind of use as a vehicle today to talk about spatial practice and to talk about spatial injustices and to talk about how through education and through practice we might work through some of those ideas, and to certainly share how I approach that, which is not a conclusive or definitive methodology or theory. I'm just really sharing in a way in the form of conjectures, the way my work has operated. So my work has vacillated, currently vacillates between the work that I do here and what was a practice in Trinidad that varied between doing kind of social impact projects and also houses for wealthy people, which became a kind of quite a difficult paradigm to operate in. It was a way of making a living, but certainly wasn't in any kind of fundamental or tangible way, I think, a way of satisfying a desire for correcting spatial justice, what I understood spatial injustices. And I got very interested at one stage of my practice in anthropology through meeting a number of anthropologists, particularly Maxine Clark, who was at Yale at the time, who I met in Trinidad, and who introduced me to, I think, methodologies that anthropologists use in their work, techniques and modes of operation that they had used and continue to use. And I attended various sort of anthropological conferences. And for those of you who are watching this in South Africa, I know you're probably familiar with this sequence of slides because I've been using it quite a lot recently. But this is a drawing by a Canadian anthropologist that I was introduced to, called Jean Mallory, and it fascinated me because it was a diagram made by somebody who wasn't an architect or a designer. He was an anthropologist, and he was studying, in this drawing, an Inuit community in Canada, and you can see the concentric circles there. those are the years. So the circles near the center are the time this was drawn, near to the time this was drawn. It was drawn in the 60s. And as you see, moving out through the concentric circles, the time going back from 1950 back to 1860. And the little black dots you can see are people. They're the lives of people, the lives of families. And the lines connecting them are the marriages and the unions and the connections that linked people in the village that was in question. And also that it's spatialized, you know, it's located in relation to certain key buildings within a landscape. So this idea of a kind of cartographic reading of something that is not simply a topography became something very interesting for me, and has become a kind of useful lens for understanding how I operate and how practitioners might operate with spatially in terms of understanding the location of their work and their practices in relation to the themes, ideas that concern them. This is a fairly famous map by Charles Jenks, where he sort of maps modern movements in architecture that Alejandro Zaire-Pola subsequently developed in this diagram. Ostensibly very useful diagrams in terms of their capacity to map movements and practices of architecture, but recently challenged, I think, in a really, really potent way by Cruz, Garcia, and Natalie Frankowski with their, I don't even want to call it alternative reading, their critical reading or critical mapping of movements or ideas that are central to an understanding of where architecture is, where it lies, and how we might interpret it, and how important that lens is, and how important the nuanced position of the observer or the cartographer, in a way, of the subject. This is a radically different proposition to this. And, you know, whereas Charles Jenks's diagram excludes a sort of significant part of the world, I think Cruz and Natalie tried to embrace ideas that have been pushed out, you know, omitted or deleted in a way from the presence. Again, I think it speaks to this idea of spatial justice, in this case, the mapping or charting of spatial injustices and spatial and notions around spatial justice through historical facts and events, and a demonstration of the diversity or the range of interpretations to which these ideas are subject. So the idea that cartography is some kind of, you know, neutral or objective mechanism or operation for reading or understanding the world, I think, is challenged by these ideas, and really brings to the foreground the idea of how important a kind of critical mapping or critical understanding is to the production of architecture. And finally, this important map, chart or cartography, which is from Architecture, Apartheid and After, the publication from the Netherlands Architecture Institute in the 90s, shortly after the apartheid regime ended. And the editors, Hilton Julin, identified a range of practitioners who all contributed to a publication that endeavored to kind of understand of the South African architectural spatial landscape. And we can see here very clearly the superimposition of the names of the contributors laid over the critical themes and concerns that occupied the imagination or the interest, the curiosities of practitioners of that time. So I think here we have a really valuable cartography of ideas that specifically, again, addresses the idea of spatial justice, but is embedded in the practice of the production of architectural knowledge, in this case, through a text or a series of texts. So these are ideas that that interest me and that fascinate me, and were kind of omitted in a way from when I began trying to kind of comprehend or decipher my own landscape and the landscape of Trinidad. Michel Jean Casabon was a painter who painted Trinidad in the 19th century and depicted, you know, scenes as he observed of the city But these paintings became really very useful for me early on in my practice. They became a way of unraveling or revealing the nature and the structure of the city of Port of Spain, way of understanding the landscape, way of understanding the environment. So rather than being images that depicted scenes, for me, they also became kind of cartographies or maps in many places of places and spaces that I knew very, very well, had been surrounded with and continue to be surrounded with working and living in Trinidad. So again, the idea here of an architectural practice or a body of architectural research that's revealed, that is mapped through experience and through engagement, not with simply knowledge around the construction of buildings, but through interpretations or ideas embedded in or encoded within other representations of space. So I would view Michel Jean Casabon's paintings as a form of spatial practice that address and revealed aspects of spatial characteristic dimensions of space, but also spatial injustices. Perhaps a reading in the same way of the space or the interpretations of space that maybe is comparable perhaps to Cruz and Natalie's reinterpretation of Charles Jenks's. So this, again, this notion of cartographies or landscapes of knowledge being equated to topographical landscapes, and the importance of developing skills in reading or interpreting these ideas, embedded ideas or knowledges or tropes. And that's an interest that for me, in many ways exists through photography. Part of my practice is the photographic practice. And by that, I don't mean that I take photographs for a living, but very much part of the work that I see that I do. Part of it is as an educator, part of it is in being involved with the design and production of buildings and urban spaces, but part of it is also creating photographs, mapping, creating a map or cartography of my own experiences through photography and through understanding and reading or interpreting existing photographs. These are photographs from an exhibition that I helped curate with the Trinidadian photographer Abigail Hadid called Record, Art and Memory. And we identified archives, photographic archives that we then organized in an exhibition that allowed us to kind of have this oversight, not just of an archival record, demonstration of a series of artifacts that constituted an archival record, but also a reading of the space, a map that charted in sometimes random ways experiences, moments in time, capturing moments in time in specific and particular spaces that are familiar to us, but also constituting a form of spatialized knowledge, fragmentary embrace or collation of images, eidetic images. Eidetic as in an image that embodies a set of ideas that may not be explicit ideas, they may be tacit ideas. And again, also ideas that contain very powerful coded messages about the social structure, about the societal structure, about the sociological, the political, the ethnographic structure of the space and how it operated in particular ways. And for me, these types of images, whether they're archival, the ones I take are, I find in many ways far more powerful, relevant, pertinent than, or let's say as pertinent or relevant, let's say that as essays or writing or knowledges that are through which architectural knowledge is traditionally communicated. a practice that's driven by an understanding and deciphering interpretation of space that in some instances depicts not just the beautiful or the ideal or the unusual, but also the catastrophic, also the tragic. David Scott, in Conscripts of Modernity, talks about dramatic values as being ciphers through which we might understand our own essence, our own existence, and particularly in the context of the Caribbean. In Conscripts, he talks about the Black Jacobins by C.L.R. James, in which C.L.R. James tells the story of the Haitian Revolution. And in many ways, it's a story that embodies an idea of heroism and victory and kind of goodness. But David analyzes this and reflects on it and talks also about how the book or the story also embodies a tragedy, and how our histories, Caribbean histories, need to be articulated, not simplistic dialogues of heroism, good and bad, or sort of oversimplified or essentialist doctrinaire ways of looking at it, but perhaps through a range of lenses that include tragedy, that also include the comic, that can include the romantic, that include the heroic, but that we need to be truthful in a way to the sensibilities that we afford ourselves in how we interpret or read or inhabit space, and very particularly as creative practitioners who have a kind of responsibility or duty to, I think, posit propositions that are responsive in multiple ways. Whilst we might perhaps normally associate the idea of spatial justice with housing or provision of utilities and fundamental requirements of working or rural people, there's also, I think, the responsibility of architecture to infuse human existence with a range of emotions, including delight. A lot of conversations I have in South Africa with people who grew up in townships, townships in their essential formation constitute something abhorrent in terms of their spatial essence. They nevertheless contained lives and contained lives of people who fell in love and who engaged in friendships and in relationships and lived full lives, albeit contained within the confines of a politically abhorrent and spatially abhorrent model. So I think the idea of adopting critical observations when we're understanding these notions or modalities is really very, very important. I think it's also important we don't simply reduce it or reduce our practices in operating in these spaces to oversimplified responses, and we recognize the complexity of the critical role of practitioners and creative practitioners in formulating propositional ideas, propositional spaces. We're proposing spaces that are new or reinterpretations of existing spaces, but these are complex and nuanced if we look historically at spaces, and will continue to be complex and nuanced as they advance. So our critical interpretation of what we see, I think, is really important. Irene, yes. Your mic is off.
This is just my gentle reminder that you have a couple minutes.
Okay, sure.
Thank you.
Yeah, so essentially, this is a kind of overview of a kind of photographic dimension of the practice, and an approach to practice, an approach to interpretation. And to quickly go through some images of perhaps some more conventional interpretations of space. Jacques Berthelot's book, Casantier, written in Creole, written in English, and also written in French, I think speaks to perhaps a conventional interpretation of form, a kind of typological interpretation of form, the ideas that surround the production of architecture. that I think constitutes a kind of parallel reading. When we look at how space traditionally is formed or understood or interpreted through this historical lens of architectural production, as if there's a kind of a line that runs through architectural history that's constantly reinventing itself and progressing and advancing itself through processes of modernization, through processes of technological advancement. It's still nevertheless a singular narrative. But the way that we read spaces, the way that we interpret spaces, these are some photographs I took when I first visited Johannesburg, I think can be as revealing in terms of how they surface knowledges about urban development, about how we interpret those readings, how those readings or those understandings are seen or observed in nuanced ways. And in these are now of Lagos, can be, I think, instrumental in determining how we make architecture and how architecture is produced and how it's framed. And I think it's something that is often forgotten in the processes of the production, but is a necessary process of observation and I'd call it selective viewing or interpretive viewing. So Cité Soleil outside Port-au-Prince. And I think in my case, and here as I've shown, photographic practice becomes a means of deciphering these spaces. These are some images that I took very recently in Cape Town. I visited Robben Island, and I was struck by how, firstly, it's a grim experience, but I was struck by how potent the spaces were, how the emptiness of the spaces were in terms of how they conveyed kind of the resonant memorial value of the types of space. Also that landscape can accommodate these notions or ideas of space that constitute readings or understandings of land, the occupation of landscapes at different level. I worked with Tao Sule a couple of years ago on a project at Cornell where we were looking at the landscape of Trinidad, not through the sort of traditional historical or colonial lens, sort of linear lens, but trying to understand Trinidad through something that I think is now commonly pursued in architectural research, but through understanding processes of extraction and how those processes of extraction were interpreted and represented and contrasted quite strongly and adversely with the conventional ways in which Caribbean landscapes are traditionally understood. And this is the work of some of the students, some of the work we did with some of the students where we visited sites of extraction, revealing again how commonly held interpretation of landscapes, these are some images of New York, often conceal, in a sense, more nuanced readings of how those landscapes actually operate. You know, we tend to think of New York in this way, but New York is actually built on a landscape that looks rather like that. So again, the idea of using ways of observing, of mapping, of touching, of drawing, of creating cartographies of landscapes as a tool and as a means of interpreting them, I think can become a really powerful device in terms of how we advance and create and generate strategies around which we can formulate more spatially just propositions, because they allow us to distinguish and distill differences, distill essences. Images here of Johannesburg, how Johannesburg was formed through extraction, through exploitation, how this led to the segregation, racialized politics. Some images here by Leon Krieger of the subsequent landscape engagement, the transformation of it. And this drawing by Marcelo Stamm, there'll be a few more minutes here and then I'll be finished. This drawing by Marcelo Stamm, who's helping us at the school understand this relationship between moving from ideas around practice and taking journeys into different disciplines and different sets or bodies of ideas, but the importance of bringing those ideas back again, back into architecture. And in my practice, you know, I've tried to break down and look at simplistic notional ideas of, let's say, rooms, encountered spaces, how the interpretation of those spaces can be translated and transformed into spatial choreographies that are integrated into landscapes and then form their own sort of provisional notional ideas that constitute a kind of independent mapping. So architecture can be a register of the landscape, but also a register of the society, constitutes a form of mapping or surveying. It's my father on the left who is a surveyor. Yeah, and I think that's really it. It's really a kind of, I suppose, a speculation on how kind of nuanced views of space, interpretations of space, establishing kind of personalized relationships to space, which is what the work we do at the school is about. Understanding one's own physical, sometimes bodily, corporeal relationship to space is actually, I think, a critical exercise in the same way that how we observe space, how we land ourselves, how we ground ourselves in space are absolutely essential in terms of practical. It's a vehicle through which I think we are able then to execute or work through coherent ideas of spatial practice, because these are lived and embodied experiences. By understanding our own corporeal, our own eidetic understanding of space, I think we get closer to a clearer, more lucid means of practicing within spaces. And I think I'll end there. I hope I didn't go over too long, sorry.
Well, thank you so much. That's really beautiful meditation. I'm really excited to talk more about observations and methodologies and corporeal relationships. But we will turn now to Helen Regis, who is I didn't write down your title. It's okay. Has been involved in urban, public, collaborative, and applied anthropology for over 2 decades, working in the US, Europe, and West Africa as a bicultural anthropologist at LSU, and is board president of the Neighborhood Story Project, an organization that creates collaborative exhibits, ethnographies, and events in New Orleans. After the 2010 oil disaster, Helen led an effort to study the role of subsistence fishing, hunting, and gardening in coastal Louisiana, leading to a forthcoming book, Bioharvest with Shauna Walton. She teaches courses from first-year introductions to graduate seminars on comics and graphic narrative, feminist, decolonial, and multi-species ethnography, and the history of anthropology. And I'm delighted to hear the connections that already are promising and percolating.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Irene. I'm really thrilled to be part of this initiative and to have an opportunity to be in the space with you all. It's a difficult, in some ways, talk to follow because there's so much there, and I'm not at all positioning myself as someone who's going to be able to unpack all those images and provocations. I'm sure we could spend a few hours together talking through several of the points that Mark has made in our time together. I would just thought I might begin perhaps with this idea of transformational pedagogy that you really, Mark, that you opened your talk with, pointing to this having very specific meanings in the context of South Africa with the long legacy of apartheid. And just gonna, now that I'm seeing myself on a bigger screen, I'm gonna blur my background. One of the things that's been a part of my own research and practice in New Orleans has been thinking a lot about the embodied experience of urban space, particularly participating in and learning from parades, specifically the Black parade tradition in New Orleans. That this time of year, there are parades that go on every Sunday afternoon for about 4 hours that move through different neighborhoods of the city. And in part through my own experience, learning about the city and how to be in the city through participating in and following parades. And then through a series of long kind of life narrative interviews with participants, I've learned about the parade. I've learned to see parades as a form of transformative pedagogy, essentially teaching those of us who are born here and those of us who have come here from other places, how to be in the city together and how to experience sort of beauty and joy and solidarity amidst all of the persistent issues that we deal with in American cities, what some urban ethnographers have called social apartheid in the US as well, right? In terms of the long legacies of Jim Crow and uneven development, uneven investment, redlining, and of course, uneven and discriminatory policing. So what I'd actually planned to talk about today is another project, but which has to do with Jazz Fest and Cartographies of Joy. But I wanted to sort of begin my remarks with parades because I bring what I've learned from parades with me into all these other projects as well. And in some of my writings about the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Festival, I've actually suggested that in some ways, the founders of this festival were inspired not just by New Orleans jazz and the vibrant cultural heritage of the city, but specifically by this parade tradition that is participatory and that has a democratic and egalitarian ethos. So let me just look at my notes for a second and see what I had actually planned to say. I'm drawing from a recent article, which I co-authored with Shauna Walton, that's based on a series of 200 hand-drawn maps created by festival goers during the annual festival, which takes place in April and May in New Orleans. And in our writing, we explore the subtle and not so subtle ways that maps can convey experience of festival landscapes, and the ways in which those both reflect and subvert, or reflect, intensify, and subvert the norms that organize everyday life. So perhaps I will share just this one image with you all today. Let's see if is that working?
Yeah, perfect.
Great. In a nod to the ongoing vibrant debates about the meaning of carnival in the Caribbean and beyond, we ask how festival can at times reinforce, undermine, or potentially reverse dominant social hierarchies. In our ethnographic research with festival goers, staff, artists, neighbors, and activists has shown clearly that the festival, has done both at different moments in its history. It can itself have a transformational pedagogy that enacts a social critique, particularly of a history that marginalized and trivialized the artistic contributions of Black musicians, creating shared spaces for appreciating and listening to music and dancing to music together. Part of the sort of this project of undoing the legacies of Jim Crow in a way. And I think this map, Dancing at the Center of the Universe, really shows the enthusiastic perspective of actually a group of fest goers who made this map together. The lead map maker, Allison, drew this map of her musical universe. From the top of the drawing, moving clockwise, she labeled the sun's rays with a series of words and phrases. Friends, family, love, music, beauty, laissez les bons temps rouler, or let the good times roll in English. New Orleans, surprise, laughter, amazement, tradition, happiness, joy. Allison, at the time that this map was made, she was part of a group of friends who reunited at the Jazz Fest every year in a ritual that embodies what Sarah Ahmed has called a way of belonging to an affective community. Some of you may know Sarah Ahmed's critical study of happiness, which really shaped my thinking in this article. So this map sketches a cosmology that's in no way trying to be a literal or a descriptive representation of festival landscapes, but it's really charts an affective landscape with sincerity, reverence, humor, The admission ticket itself is the spaceship providing entry to this universe that transforms friends into a space-time set aside for play. Significantly, the map of planets radiating activities, emotions, and experience charts this landscape of places such as the Congo, which is, of course, a reference to the Republic of Congo, but for New Orleanians, it's also a reference to Congo Square, a site located outside of the historic city, which is now the French Quarter, where Africans who were enslaved and those who were free had a space of gathering for music, dance, ceremony, and exchange. And indigenous people are documented to have participated in those events as well as a number of white onlookers. So the festival itself has a space called Congo Square. This map doesn't speak to that history, but that space within the festival landscape was actually created through the activism of Black social activists in the 1970s. So for just a moment, I'll just say something about the history. So the festival was founded in 1970, just on the heels of the desegregation of public accommodations in the city. And by the mid to late 70s, it started to turn a profit. And this prompted a number of political activists in the city to examine its structures of production and the ways in which what they understood to be their heritage and their culture was being put on display for profit. They organized a boycott of the festival in 1977 and 1978 and demanded access to the structures of production in a number of roles, including serving on the board of directors as professional staff, but also greater access to the marketplace of the festival for Black artists. So in this map, that history is not foregrounded, right? The Congo Square is there as a given, in addition to other kind of sensory experiences, such as the sea of Fail and Quiescent gumbo, which is a reference to the quail and pheasant gumbo, which is famously sold at the festival. I don't know if I should zoom in on this particular, if I can do it. Oh, maybe not. The compass at the bottom right of the map that indexes the orientations of festivalizing from the perspective of this group of friends. Laugh, cry, eat, drink, and dance as the as sort of the cardinal injunctions of festivalizing. So this is a good place for me to pause and think about what is the relevance of thinking about, and I'll just stop share for a moment. This could be a little distracting. What's the significance of thinking about happiness and joy in a landscape like New Orleans, where the structures, structural violence and the ongoing legacies of enslavement, Jim Crow, are so well known and were so dramatically revealed to people outside the city almost 20 years ago during Hurricane Katrina. In thinking about this, I draw a lot on the scholarship of Bianca Williams, whose book, The Pursuit of Happiness, actually looks at Black women, diasporic dreams, and the politics of emotional transnationalism. In her ethnography of a group of women who travel to Jamaica every year, she charts their affective journeys, their self-determination, noting that these are political, even or perhaps especially in leisure, travel, and pleasure. So there's through Bianca Williams and others, there's a really interesting sort of body of scholarship that critically interrogates happiness and joy in relation to what's been called the anthropology of trouble, which is the legacy in for very good reasons in scholarship, social science scholarship, and particularly anthropology, of really zeroing in on spaces of inequality and suffering. And so what's interesting to me about this festival and the maps that map makers themselves created is that it's a space for thinking in terms of both and the ongoing legacies of structured inequality and structural violence, and the possibilities for a pedagogy of transformation. How am I doing on time?
Closing time 1 to 2 minutes.
Okay.
Thank
All
you.
right. Okay. So I just want to say a little bit about how we approach the maps, because Mark had such an evocative and really illuminating way of talking about the role of photography and archival photography for his own thinking and practice. We thought about cartography, we use the term cartography to point to the making of maps as an embodied research practice in which we invited festgoers to create hand-drawn maps of their experience. So we're not saying that these maps sort of express pre-existing cognitive maps that are somehow in the brain, right? We see these as generative conversations that happen between people, right, in particular situations. So the map that you might draw at the festival is not the same as the map you might draw at home or in conversation with others. We consider the generative possibilities of co-creation as a research practice. And another map that I'm not showing you, which showed a very dark spiral drawn in charcoal pencil by a festival goer and a friend who refused the colored crayons and beautiful markers that we offered, really showed the critique of the festival that's also very widely shared, but that is somehow, through either etiquette or taboo, rarely spoken out loud in the context of the festival itself, where it risks spoiling someone's pleasure. When my friend Alton drew that map, his drawing came to perform a feeling that many New Orleanians express outside the festival gates, but rarely inside it. It's as if once inside the gates, we must succumb to festival magic or risk spoiling someone's pleasure. In writing this article in the midst of protests against police violence, pandemic shutdowns and online teaching, and the climate grief generated in Louisiana by Hurricane Ida, it's been difficult to hold on to the joy part of this research and to continue to foreground this in our writing. And in thinking through that dilemma, I want to just for a moment just quote poet and essayist Ross Gay, whose book Inciting Joy came across my desk at just the right time. He provides some pertinent analysis of how everyday life can become the grounds for joy, and I think provides an interesting perspective on how thinking about and writing about joy as part of our practice can help us to also think more deeply about issues of spatial justice. Gay writes about the occasions in everyday life that can become the grounds for joy. And he, in one of his essays, he voices the vexing question in the voice of a critic. Yeah, but isn't gardening a privilege? I mean, how could he be talking about gardens at a time like this? Gardens and joy, the question understands, are privileges. And he responds to this critic that he has himself, voiced and written about. Great point, he says. And one thing I want to be cautious of, by which I really mean refuse, are the ways we sometimes consider, for example, gardening as a privilege, which actually obscures the fact that to be without a garden, or to be without green space, or to be without access to a park or clean water is violence. It is abnormal even if it is the norm. And it is an imposition of precarity that is not natural. And he concludes this essay by thinking that by arguing that joy can be a precursor or an ember for transgressive and unbounded solidarity. That solidarity might lead to further joy, which might incite further solidarity. My hunch, he writes, is that joy emerging from our common sorrow, which does not necessarily mean that we have the same sorrows, but that we, in common sorrow, might draw us together. It might depolarize us and deatomize us enough that we can consider what in common we love. Thank you.
Wow, thank you. That was a really beautiful reflection to share with us. Thank you. Okay, I'm gonna pose one question while those of you who are in attendance can take a moment to digest and come up with some questions to ask yourself or put in the chat, or comments. You don't have to apologize, your comment instead of a question. Yeah, I think there's so many ways, and I think I'm touched by where we ended, because I think, Helen, you really gave us a beautiful example of what Mark was talking about the complexity of feelings and emotions and experiences in places that are often reduced to simplistic ideas of violence, suffering, heroism, etc. And it really resonates with something. A couple of weeks ago, I was at a gathering about Haitian art and design, and Erol Josue, who's the head of the Bureau d'Ethnologie in Haiti, speaking to the conflicts in Haiti right now, was talking about the importance of art and dignity and beauty and dreaming a world that we want to be a part of. So I'm loving that Roske and Erol are in conversation now in my mind. Okay, here's a question. I was trying to think, Mark, you put on the table that when we talk about spatial justice or injustice, we end up in these cross-disciplinary spaces. So it is not an accident that we have an anthropologist and an architect here today. So my first thought was like, what's the relationship between observation and production? But then I kind of undercut that, because I think what you've both shown us is how observation is a product. But I'd love to hear both of you to reflect on how you teach observation. And I've been thinking about Anna Singh a lot lately. She has this beautiful phrase, the art of noticing. My students in the audience recognize this one. Yeah, how do you teach, or maybe just elicit or encourage the practice of noticing in your respective disciplines?
Well, I don't mind starting that. First of all, I think it's like fundamental that students are encouraged to acknowledge that observation is a critical part of their practice. That sometimes the kind of fundamental dimensions of how there are kind of presumptions about knowledge and about what you need to know and the skills that you have to articulate or to explicate that knowledge through interpretation. There are a set of presumptions, and I think they're presumptions and assumptions that often then completely mask any kind of critical interpretation. So I think that, first of all, it's in a sense acknowledging that observing is part of your practice. That if you're a creative practitioner, simply observing things constitutes a fundamental and profound form of research in and of itself. And it's probably, the quintessential or ultimate primary source, rather than a text or something else that somebody else has done. And I think certainly in the situation here, and in many architecture schools that I'm aware of, the assumptions are that as you sort of progress up through academic systems, that you've learned that you're equipped with a whole set of tools and knowledges And in many cases, people aren't, you know, and I think it takes a lifetime to kind of become remotely articulate in being able to articulate what you've observed. I think it's why we value the work of poets and artists and photographers, because they have somehow been able to kind of master in very particular, specific ways that capacity. But it's really a critical skill for somebody that's producing things to be able to observe them. And when I say creative practice, I would argue that anthropology is a creative practice, you know, that anything where you're producing knowledge is a creative practice. So observation is just fundamental. And how you teach it, I think, is by setting activities or asking students to move in and around space and to make observations and to express those observations, you know? And then to start there, put it as simply as that. It's very important here, because I think the particular complexity of this place and the particular idiomatic way in which architectural knowledge is generally received or appropriated in architectural education, it makes it even more important, because we don't want to look at spaces in the way that we've been conventionally disposed to look at them, because it's perpetuating mythologies or ideas about space that we need to unpack and unravel.
Oh, unmute. Yep.
I really like this question, and I agree with very much with what Mark has said so far. It is very much a practice, right? It is something that you practice, and I've had some wonderful experiences being able to bring students into a shared space where we practice noticing together and take notes or make drawings or take photos, and then come back together to share them and see how we've noticed completely different things. And so I think for us as learners to sort of be able to read each other's noticings and reflect back is really important. And I definitely think that for me, that's an ongoing learning process, but it's definitely something I try to share with students. We sometimes, particularly in anthropology, we have a tendency to sometimes, because of the long history of our discipline, to think that it's important to notice other people, or perhaps spaces that are different from those in which we were raised up. But I try in my classes to also encourage students to write about and reflect on and notice the taken for granted aspects of the landscapes and the places in which they've grown up, doing some reflexive writing and autoethnography. And I really love the projects that, Mark, that you were sharing at the beginning of your talk that are so beautiful and thought-provoking and evocative. So in a class I just taught last year on race, identity, and difference, students wrote kind of autoethnographies of their own kind of family heritage and family stories, interviewing family members, looking for archives, looking for images in the photo album that could give them clues about some unspoken aspects of their heritage. And I think that practicing that sort of in one's own kind of home, when that's possible. I know that's not possible for everyone, but that can be something that can help us to notice in the presence of people who are also different from us or in new spaces.
Let me add to the discussion, because since the topic, I would say today, center was presented, and also following this discussion, I have been thinking in the relation between the cartographies and this spatial justice idea, or spatial inequality, and everything that is related with that. And I was thinking if this can be designed in some sort of question, but the spatial justice concept, as we understand it nowadays, is a relatively recent idea. And I was thinking if that is related with the fact that we needed some special ways of representation to be able to see those inequalities in a way. I mean, it was when we could represent them in an image or something similar that we could start understand them a bit better. So maybe that representation process, those cartographies, those images, those collage, were the actual bridge to make something visible. And at the same time, I was thinking, going back to the maps, I mean, that you both show, we have the things that are being shown and those that are not. So it's like a double process where you emphasize something and also you are leaving aside many others. As Helen was saying now, I mean, each one of us will like understand and highlight different things. So how we represent them also shows that in a way. So briefly, I wanted to ask if this, like, what kind of relation do you think we can understand between this concept of spatial justice and how we represent that on any media?
I think it's interesting that we've really been, and Mark has really laid out for us like such a diverse array of ways of mapping, right, and ways of thinking about mapping and making visible or bringing visions of space and landscape and being into consciousness. And obviously, there's been an intensification of mapping technologies and perhaps a diversification of mapping technologies. I'm not sure about that part. But I think there have been story maps, since there have been people to tell stories. So I do think that there's been some critical consciousness of spatial justice for a very long time. Just thinking in terms of my own project, before community activists had perhaps GIS technologies at their fingertips, they were nonetheless observing spatial inequality, right, and talking about it. So that, for example, some of the activists who were involved in organizing a boycott of Jazz Fest in the 70s, they were veterans of an earlier struggle to desegregate Canal Street, which had been for a long time a main commercial artery in New Orleans, and on the edge of the French Quarter. And in the 1970s, there was not a single Black-owned business on Canal Street, right? So that was a legacy of the American version of racial apartheid that was visible and palpable, right? And it was related to people, obviously, activists critically analyzing the ways in which gaining civil rights was not in and of itself, and voting rights leveling out long-term and entrenched economic inequality in the city. So I think there are different ways of mapping, and it's interesting to think about like how perhaps our different technologies of mapping can be wielded in distinctive ways. It's just a thought.
Yeah, no, I mean, yeah, that's a nice response. I think, what you said earlier, Fabio, about, what's omitted is as important, or possibly more important than what's there. It's like the map in a way is just a reflection of how we see something. It's not definitive. I remember, as a child, I used to be fascinated looking at maps, looking at drawn maps. And then I remember when Landsat photographs appeared, the first photographic depictions of the Earth, and my delight at Google Earth, but somehow the kind of the sophistication and the expansive detail that can be embraced technologically doesn't seem any more sophisticated than, say, the maps that Helen just shared. You know, they're both ways of reflecting how something is seen, you know. So I think what interests me is how is, you know, if we're thinking about spatial justice and how does a map relate to, how does cartography relate to that? It's how do we use the idea of cartographic representation if we're concerned with spatial justice? It's not necessarily that we are mapping spatial injustice. We might choose to do that, but if we're concerned with it, then we have to be concerned with how we see the world, and we have to be concerned that there are different ways in which we can see it. We can be analytical, we can be skeptical, we can be comical about how we interpret it. But as spatial practitioners, I think we need to develop an agility and a fluency with deploying that sensibility we have in terms of cartographic projection. To me, that's, you know, whether it's technological or not, it's about kind of discernment. You know, a little bit like the way, you know, fine artists practice drawing life models. You know, it's not about the beauty of the human form. It's about the process of observing and recognizing the need to practice the translation of that process. In a sense, the body is just used because it's like a fundamental unit of something that can be represented. You know? So in this conversation, we're saying that emblem is spatial injustice. And I think, you know, what we've raised is this idea of the role of cartography in that. How it can be deployed, how that could be applied as a tool to reveal knowledge or knowledges, or how it in a sense, how imperative it is as a tool of interpretation. Not sure if that answered your question, but it's a reflection on what you prompted.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. Thank you both.
So shall we, somehow time always gets away, could we take 2 or 3 questions and then have a final reflection based on them? We have Elisa's comment in the chat. So if you'd like to raise your hand or type into the chat, now's the time.
Don't be shy.
I'm going to use the silence to summarize and voice Elisa's comment, which I really appreciate. Yeah, that she's grown used to mapping events of violence to conduct social cartography in which people spatialize perceptions of danger in space, but thinking about what is gone, the joy, the social spaces, the traditional processions is also very valuable testimony. Yeah, which I was coming into today thinking more about violence, right, and thinking about so many points on the globe right now, but thinking about the street in Haiti, which Isabelle Jolicoeur has written about, and we'll hear from her in the spring. Because as people like create fortresses to keep themselves safe, they've created a way where where urban public space is missing a lot of the things that people valued, right? Like places of exchange and gathering. Okay, truly no hands. Oh, Isabel's here. Hi. Well, do you have questions for each other, perhaps?
I have lots of questions. You know, I mean, I really like those maps. And I wondered if they're like available anywhere, and if they're part of a kind of suite of studies of maps like that.
It's really interesting. The 200 maps that were collected at the festival are archived at the New Orleans Jazz and Heritage Archive, which was a research partner on the project. They're not currently on a website where they're publicly available, but you can come into the archive and view them and study them.
I was curious about what would happen if you gave them a camera, and asked them to record how they experienced the carnival.
Yeah, I actually one of our anthropology alums who just graduated recently, Maddie Fusel, was looking at photography around parades outside the gates of the festival in the streets of New Orleans, and it was actually using Instagram as a platform, as a research method to look at how participants in parades are visualizing their own experience of themselves in public space. And then obviously the complex algorithmic interactions that happen around images that get posted. But she's beginning to theorize those as an extension of the interactions that take place in the streets outside of the time frame, the Sunday afternoon time frame of the parades.
They seem diagrammatic, the maps he showed. They were like a plan, like a planimetric organization. And I know some anthropologists. I know Kamari Clark did some work with Ale Wiseman from Forensic Architecture about mapping, and Deborah Thomas at Penn has done some work in Jamaica mapping events, of violence or civil unrest in Jamaica using those techniques. And then recently, Antonio Thomas at our school, who's an anthropologist, has been working with some students mapping boundaries of, from the struggle and shifting boundaries. And so I think there's a really extraordinary intersection, I said, that I kind of picked up early in my research journey. It's quite fascinating the way that the spatial dimension of anthropological research finds quite an interesting kind of home within architectural or spatial techniques of projection. When I go to anthropological conferences, and I've not been to a lot, but those that I have been to, I always sit there thinking, this could be an architectural school, because of the way that the anthropologists are articulating their understanding of the occupation of space. But the role of mapping or cartographic engagement with that, I think, is really interesting, and particularly at this intersection when one is looking at conflict or contestation, and the need somehow to articulate it spatially. It suggests that something that words can't do or text can't do, that it needs to be made, it needs to be spatialized. I think it's so it's like spatialized injustice. There's some interesting new ideas that emerge from that intersection.
This is making my ethnography of design heart like explode. I agree completely. Sorry.
No, I just want to say that I really appreciate the interdisciplinarity of this conversation and the generosity of around that. And I think that for me, having an ongoing research project in the city of New Orleans at the time of Hurricane Katrina and the levee failures, I had a number of opportunities to interact very closely with to work closely with architects and urban planners. And so that's been such an interesting and enriching experience to think about how we sometimes use the same words, but quite differently. And yet we have so many of the shared interests, right? And shared questions about living together in the city and how to design spaces in which we can actually live together. So one of the first articles that I wrote with a colleague, Rachel Brenlin, after the levee failures was really drawing on African-American social aid and pleasure clubs' own understandings of the landscape as inscribed through their parades, through their embodied parades. And we called it putting the ninth ward on the map. So it was really all about how parades are a way of reclaiming urban space prior to the floods, right? But then that were also being redeployed after Katrina in new ways to reclaim the city. And their knowledge about space and the knowledge of social clubs was not well represented in the planning charrettes that occurred after the disaster, right? So it was an interesting project to try to move that knowledge into different spaces. And for that reason, the members of the 9 Times Social Aid and Pleasure Club, which parades in the 9th Ward, actually wrote a book about their understanding of the city through the lens of their neighborhood and parades. And it's called Coming Out the Door for the 9th Ward, published by the Neighborhood Story Project. And when that book came out in 2006, and was involved in conversations throughout the city, it sort of helped to bring that knowledge into circulation, into different circles beyond the circles of the club members themselves.
Thank you. Maybe you could drop the citation for that in the chat. We do need to close. So this is successful because I have 4 more questions to ask. That I won't. So Fabio, could you put the share screen? I want to thank both of you and everyone who was here today. I think this is just a beautiful beginning to a lot of conversations. We have two events to announce. One is an event co-sponsored by the Haitian Studies Association that I participate in, called An Island in the Chain, discussing the current urgent conflicts over lines happening at Haiti and the DR next week. So please, I think there might be people here who would find this an interesting and compelling conversation. And then we very much hope that you'll join us for colloquium number 3. We're getting into our rhythm, second Friday in November, November 17th with Maria Veronica Machado, talking about agriculture and biodiversity. So this should be a wonderful conversation. Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, also thank you. Also, I mean, not only the guests, of course, but also thank you, Henia and Celica, who helped today with the interpretation. As Irene said, we hope to see you in the next session.
Okay.
Have a good weekend, everyone.
À la prochaine.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.